Late August 1944. The most successful offensive in military history is about to hit an invisible wall. Allied armies are tearing across France, chasing a shattered German military toward the borders of the Reich. But deep inside Supreme Headquarters, panic is setting in. This crisis isn't caused by a sudden resurgence of German panzers. It is triggered by a catastrophic shortage of a single liquid, gasoline. Driven to the absolute limit of their supply lines, the fastest, most mechanized army ever assembled is facing total paralysis, choked by its own overwhelming success. This dry fuel gauge is about to ignite a completely different kind of war behind closed doors. This is the anatomy of a bitter, highly classified clash that threatened to tear the Anglo-American alliance apart, just as final victory seemed within reach. With captured French ports still in ruins and supply lines stretched hundreds of miles past their breaking point, every drop of gasoline suddenly carries profound strategic weight. The brutal reality of logistics dictates that whoever receives the remaining fuel gets to advance and deal the killing blow. Whoever is denied must sit completely idle, watching helplessly while a shattered German military regroups. This is no longer just a puzzle of supply. It is a volatile collision of monumental egos, competing tactical visions, and raw national pride. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower finds himself trapped at the center of this standoff. He must balance the immediate demands of the battlefield with the intense political pressure of keeping two proud, exhausted nations united. Can Eisenhower preserve this fragile coalition? When the simple act of allocating gasoline forces a choice between a swift, daring end to the war and a prolonged, incredibly bloody winter. The root of this impossible choice lay in the sheer physics of the Allied breakout. Following the launch of Operation Cobra in late July, the static, grinding nightmare of the Normandy hedgerows suddenly ruptured into a high-speed mechanized pursuit. By the end of August 1944, American, British, and Canadian forces were sprinting across northern France and Belgium, advancing faster than any pre-invasion model had predicted. But modern mechanized warfare is absolute in its demands. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery prime movers, and supply trucks consume staggering volumes of fuel. And the further the combat elements raced toward the German border, the longer their umbilical cord of supply became. The original Overlord invasion plan relied on a methodical timetable for capturing and repairing deep-water ports along the French coast. The German High Command, fully aware of this critical vulnerability, had ordered their retreating garrisons to meticulously demolish every harbor infrastructure they abandoned. Docks were dynamited, massive cranes were dropped into shipping channels, and harbor waters were heavily seeded with mines. Consequently, as the Allied vanguard pushed hundreds of miles to the east, the supply chain remained anchored far to the west. The Allies were still relying almost entirely on the artificial mulberry harbors at Omaha Beach and the single battered port of Cherbourg, located at the very tip of the Cotentin Peninsula. This geographic reality created a mathematical nightmare. The front line was now stretching more than 300 miles away from its primary supply depots. To bridge this massive gap, logistics officers improvised one of the most audacious transportation efforts of the entire war, the Red Ball Express. Stripping vehicles from rear echelon units and running them 24 hours a day on dedicated one-way highway loops, thousands of transport trucks, driven largely by exhausted African-American quartermaster troops, hauled vital materiel toward the advancing armies. But the tyranny of distance was absolute. A loaded 2.5-ton truck driving hundreds of miles in low gear over battle-damaged roads consumes an enormous amount of fuel. The Red Ball Express convoys were burning almost as much gasoline as they were successfully delivering to the front lines. The logistical pipeline was effectively consuming itself. Surveying this strained, fragile network from his headquarters, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower remained steadfastly committed to his pre-invasion blueprint, the broad front strategy. Eisenhower's operational philosophy was inherently methodical, designed to minimize risk and maximize the Allies' overwhelming industrial superiority. He ordered his Army Group commanders to advance uniformly across the entire theater, maintaining a continuous, unbroken line stretching from the English Channel all the way down to the Swiss border. By pushing forward everywhere at once, Eisenhower ensured that no single Allied army could push too far ahead and expose its flanks to a sudden, devastating German counterattack. He reasoned that a continuous, relentless wall of pressure would stretch the battered German defenders so thin that their lines would inevitably shatter. However, the commander of the British 21st Army Group, General Sir Bernard Montgomery, viewed this approach as a catastrophic, historic mistake. Montgomery looked at the disorganized, crumbling German formations retreating in front of his tanks and believed the enemy was on the verge of total systemic collapse. In his assessment, distributing severely limited supplies equally across a broad front meant that no single army would possess the concentrated momentum required to actually punch through into Germany. He argued forcefully that the broad front was a recipe for a sluggish, grinding stalemate that would needlessly drag the war into the freezing, bitter winter, giving the German high command the precious time it needed to man the formidable Siegfried Line. Montgomery's counterproposal was radical, and he presented it with absolute, uncompromising certainty. He demanded that Eisenhower immediately halt the advance of the American armies operating to the south. He insisted that every remaining drop of gasoline, every transport plane, and every spare truck be diverted exclusively to his British and Canadian forces in the north. With this absolute monopoly on resources, Montgomery promised to launch a single, devastating, pencil-like thrust through Belgium and the Netherlands. His objective was heavily focused: bypass the dense border fortifications, cross the Rhine River, and strike directly into the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr was the industrial heart of the German war machine. If Montgomery could capture it, he argued, the Third Reich would lose its ability to manufacture weapons, effectively ending the war in Europe by Christmas of 1944. This was no longer just a theoretical debate over tactics. It was a fundamental clash of military philosophy colliding with the brutal reality of an empty fuel gauge. Because the supply crisis was so severe, the decision was strictly binary. A gallon of gasoline allocated to a British tank in the north was a gallon directly denied to an American tank in the south. Montgomery's plan required freezing half of the Allied expeditionary force in place, forcing them to sit completely idle while his command delivered the final decisive blow. And General Montgomery, fiercely assured of his own strategic brilliance and heavily backed by the political apparatus in London, was not a man who accepted refusal. Recognizing that the logistical window for a knockout blow was rapidly closing, he prepared to maneuver the Supreme Commander into a definitive, politically volatile corner. On August 23, 1944, at a tense meeting, General Montgomery formally converted his strategic vision into a blunt ultimatum. He demanded that Supreme Command abandon the broad front and place all available logistical resources behind his British 21st Army Group for a single, decisive thrust through the north. For this to succeed, Montgomery's requirement was absolute and, to American ears, outrageous. George S. Patton's rapidly advancing Third Army, moving with unprecedented speed in the south, must be halted entirely. Every transport plane, every spare truck, and every remaining gallon of gasoline had to be diverted to Montgomery's command. Eisenhower found himself in an impossible vice, balancing the frantic operational need to capture the vital deepwater port of Antwerp against the explosive political fallout of grounding his most successful American general. He made a decision that was intended as a logistical compromise, but was received as a strategic betrayal. Eisenhower conceded to Montgomery's demand for priority, granting him the bulk of the available fuel and transport, specifically to secure the northern route and the Belgian coast. When the directives to choke off their supply lines arrived, the reaction at American headquarters was one of unadulterated fury. Omar Bradley and George Patton were stunned. They were convinced they were on the verge of breaking into Germany and ending the war. Now, they suddenly realized that their victorious, high-speed pursuit across France was being deliberately paralyzed, not by German resistance, but by a conscious decision from their own supreme commander to favor a British rival. Trust among the top Allied commanders effectively evaporated, replaced by a bitter conviction among the Americans that military victory was being sacrificed for inter-Allied politics. But General Patton had no intention of simply parking his tanks and waiting out the war while Montgomery grabbed the headlines. Facing the existential threat of an empty fuel gauge, Patton launched a desperate, quasi-legal shadow campaign, ordering his logistics officers to use any means necessary, including hijacking, mislabeling, and outright theft, to secure the gasoline required to keep the Third Army moving, in open defiance of the Supreme Commander's allocation plan. To George S. Patton, the Supreme Commander's directive was not merely a strategic compromise. It was a profound professional insult and a violation of everything he understood about mechanized warfare. Patton's doctrine was built on relentless, unapologetic pursuit. When an enemy is broken, you do not pause to reorganize. You drive until you sever their command arteries. Facing the existential threat of a dry fuel gauge and the reality of being benched while his British rivals advanced, Patton essentially permitted the Third Army to operate as a rogue entity. His logistics officers, taking their cue directly from the aggressive temperament of their commander, initiated a desperate, quasi-legal shadow campaign to keep the tanks moving. The meticulously planned Allied supply chain broke down into outright piracy. Third Army military police were dispatched to critical intersections behind the lines, armed and authorized to intercept supply convoys destined for other American units. They altered road signs, forged shipping manifests, and literally hijacked Red Ball Express trucks, diverting thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel and standard gasoline directly into Patton's fuel dumps. Quartermaster units created phantom requisitions, exploiting the chaos of the rapid advance to hoard vital supplies. Patton, famously and without a trace of irony, boasted to his staff that his armored divisions were surviving on captured German rations and whatever gasoline they could steal from their own allies. This was a catastrophic breakdown of military subordination. The fastest, most lethal army on the European continent was cannibalizing the very logistical network Eisenhower was desperately trying to manage. But even institutionalized theft has mathematical limits. By the first week of September, the sheer physics of internal combustion finally caught up with the Third Army. As Patton's vanguard approached the formidable defenses of the Moselle River, engines began to sputter and die. The relentless, historic drive across France ground to a physical halt. Paralyzed not by the tactical brilliance of the German Wehrmacht, but because the fuel gauges had definitively hit absolute zero. Massive Sherman tanks, the terrifying instruments of the American breakout, were suddenly reduced to stationary steel pillboxes on the side of the road. While Patton was fighting a shadow war for gasoline in the muddy fields of eastern France, his immediate superior, General Omar Bradley, was fighting a bitter, high-stakes political war inside the confines of Supreme Headquarters. Bradley, the commander of the massive 12th Army Group, watched with mounting dread as the priority shift to Montgomery began to strangle the American momentum. Bradley was a pragmatist, but he was also acutely aware of the geopolitical optics driving the coalition. He relentlessly lobbied Eisenhower, stripping away the polite military jargon to expose the raw political nerve of the fuel crisis. Bradley warned the Supreme Commander that deliberately halting a victorious, rapidly advancing American army to favor a British general would trigger a political earthquake back in Washington. The year was 1944. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was facing an unprecedented fourth-term election. The American press corps was following Patton's armored sprint like a continuous victory parade, feeding the public a narrative of unstoppable American dominance. Bradley made it explicitly clear that the American public, who were funding the vast majority of the war effort and providing the overwhelming bulk of the manpower, would absolutely not tolerate their sons being sidelined in the mud to ensure that General Montgomery and the British Empire could claim the ultimate glory of crossing the Rhine first. This was a direct threat to the fragile architecture of the Anglo-American alliance. If Congress or the War Department caught wind that Patton was being intentionally starved of fuel to appease political pressures from London, the resulting backlash could shatter public support for the war effort and fundamentally threaten Eisenhower's own mandate as Supreme Commander. Eisenhower, whose primary genius lay in coalition management rather than battlefield tactics, was trapped in a terrifying paradox. He could not ignore the cold logistical reality that he simply did not possess enough gasoline to sustain everyone. But he also could not ignore the explosive political reality that favoring one flag over another threatened to tear his armies apart from the inside. And while the Allied commanders squabbled over fuel allocations, national pride, and political optics, the enemy was watching, analyzing, and adapting. From the German perspective, the month of August had been an experience of unadulterated apocalyptic terror. Following the catastrophic collapse of the Falaise Pocket, the Wehrmacht in the West was effectively annihilated as a cohesive fighting force. Divisions had been reduced to the size of battered, understrength battalions. Command and control networks had completely evaporated. The roads leading back to the borders of the Reich were choked with burning vehicles, abandoned artillery, and panicked, retreating soldiers. The door into the German homeland was wide open, and there was virtually nothing standing in the way of the American armor. But then, an eerie, inexplicable silence fell over the southern and central sectors of the front. The relentless, terrifying pressure of the American pursuit suddenly vanished. At the headquarters of Army Group B, Field Marshal Walter Model, a ruthless tactician recently appointed by Adolf Hitler to salvage the catastrophe in the West, could hardly believe the intelligence reports crossing his desk. Model, known throughout the German High Command as the Fireman of the Reich for his uncanny ability to stabilize collapsing fronts, had fully expected Patton's armor to cross the Moselle and punch directly into the vital industrial region of the Saarland within a matter of days. Instead, his forward reconnaissance units reported that the massive American armored columns were simply sitting idle in the fields, their engines completely cold, their logistics paralyzed. Model instantly grasped the strategic reality of the situation. The Allies had fundamentally outrun their own supply lines. Through their own logistical exhaustion, the Americans had inadvertently handed the German army the single resource it desperately needed, more than ammunition, tanks, or reinforcements: time. Model moved with ruthless, terrifying efficiency to exploit this critical breathing room. He ordered a massive, sweeping reorganization of his shattered forces. Deserters and stragglers were violently rounded up by military police and instantly formed into improvised ad hoc battle groups. Luftwaffe ground crews, naval personnel, and mechanics were handed anti-tank weapons and thrust into the infantry line. Flak cannons were hastily pulled from the cities of the interior and repurposed as lethal, direct-fire weapons along the border approaches. He directed the battered remnants of his panzer divisions to dig into the concrete bunkers of the West Wall, commonly known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, a formidable, layered defensive network that had been largely abandoned and stripped of its weapons earlier in the war. What had been a routed, fleeing, terrified mob just a week prior was rapidly and systematically transforming back into a cohesive, disciplined, and heavily armed wall of resistance. The Allied pause for fuel had inadvertently resurrected the German army in the west. Meanwhile, back in the northern sector, General Montgomery's prioritized advance seemed to be thoroughly validating his demands for a monopoly on the Allied fuel supply. Empowered by the gasoline specifically diverted away from the Americans, the British Second Army executed a lightning-fast, spectacular sprint across the plains of Belgium. On September 4th, the British 11th Armored Division achieved a stunning operational triumph. They rolled into the massive, sprawling port city of Antwerp, capturing it almost entirely intact. The capture of Antwerp was a logistical masterstroke that should have altered the entire trajectory of the war. Thanks to the rapid advance and the fierce actions of the Belgian resistance, the docks had been secured before the retreating German garrison could trigger their pre-planned demolition charges. The Allies suddenly held one of the largest and most sophisticated deep-water ports in the world. It boasted 26 miles of pristine wharves, intact locks, and hundreds of massive cargo cranes completely ready to begin unloading the fleets of Liberty ships waiting in the English Channel. It seemed, for a brief, euphoric moment, that the catastrophic supply nightmare was finally over. The umbilical cord of the Allied war machine could finally be relocated from the distant, battle-scarred beaches of Normandy directly to the front lines in Belgium. But in the intoxicating rush of capturing the city, Montgomery committed one of the most consequential and fatal operational errors of the entire European campaign. Antwerp is not a coastal city. It sits roughly 50 miles inland, connected to the waters of the North Sea by a winding, treacherous, and highly defensible waterway known as the Scheldt Estuary. And while British tanks triumphantly held the city center and the docks, they completely ignored the heavily fortified islands and peninsulas lining the banks of the estuary leading out to the sea. The British armored columns stopped in the city to rest, refit, and celebrate, failing to push just a few miles further north to seal off the crucial land bridges. The German High Command, however, did not miss this detail. Adolf Hitler immediately recognized that a fully operational Allied port at Antwerp would spell the definitive doom of the Third Reich. He issued a frantic, uncompromising order to the German 15th Army, which had been trapped against the Belgian coast. They were to occupy, fortify, and hold the banks of the Scheldt at all absolute costs. The German defenders moved swiftly, heavily mining the waters of the estuary and positioning massive, radar-directed coastal artillery batteries along its shores. The result was a catastrophic, maddening paradox for the Allied Expeditionary Force. They owned a pristine, massive, world-class harbor facility, but it was absolutely, fundamentally useless. Not a single Allied cargo ship could sail up the Scheldt estuary without being instantly blown out of the water by German coastal guns. The massive cranes and 26 miles of docks sat completely empty, mocking the desperate, starving armies waiting for supplies. Montgomery, entirely fixated on crossing the Rhine River and utterly consumed by his vision of a single, glorious thrust into the heart of Germany, had failed to secure the approach to the very port that could have actually sustained his advance. The logistical crisis was not solved by the capture of Antwerp. Through a failure of operational vision, it was profoundly and tragically deepened. Beneath the bitter arguments, the hijacked fuel convoys, and the political posturing, there lay a hard, unforgiving logistical truth that neither Bernard Montgomery nor George S. Patton was ever willing to publicly admit. Their fierce rivalry, their mutual disdain, and their competing strategic visions were ultimately built upon a shared, fundamental delusion regarding the realities of modern mechanized warfare. The truth, buried in the cold mathematics of the quartermaster reports, was that even if Dwight Eisenhower had capitulated entirely to either general, even if he had grounded every other army in the theater, parked every spare vehicle, and diverted every single remaining drop of gasoline and every available transport truck to either the British in the north or the Americans in the south, the single thrust strategy still would have failed. The logistical infrastructure was simply not there. The sheer volume of transport trucks, the limited carrying capacity of the battle-damaged French road network, and the immense physical distance from the makeshift harbors in Normandy meant that the supply pipeline was incapable of supporting a sustained, deep penetration drive directly into the industrial heart of Germany in the early autumn of 1944. A modern mechanized army is a voracious, consuming beast. A single American armored division required tens of thousands of gallons of gasoline every single day just to move forward, let alone engage in combat. The pipeline was physically too narrow and too long to feed that beast over a 500-mile distance, regardless of whether the requisition forms were stamped by the British or the Americans. Both the northern thrust toward the Ruhr and the southern thrust toward the Saar would have inevitably culminated, running out of fuel and ammunition long before they reached Berlin. But in the tense, exhausted, and politically charged atmosphere of Supreme Headquarters, this stark mathematical reality gave way to ego, frustration, and political positioning. The breakdown in military subordination, the spectacular hijacking of the supply convoys, the mounting political pressure emanating from both Washington and London, and the horrifying, dawning realization that the shattered German army was actually recovering in front of their eyes, all of this created a deeply toxic environment. The Allied commanders, unable to accept that they had been defeated by geography and physics, sought a silver bullet. As the stalemate hardened into a brutal reality, a dangerous and intoxicating myth began to crystallize in the minds of the Allied leadership. They convinced themselves that the sudden halt was not a failure of logistics or planning, but a failure of nerve. They began to intensely believe that if they just made one bold, unprecedented strategic gamble, they could shatter the newly stabilized German line and end the war before the freezing European winter set in. The bitter squabbling over fuel allocations had not only cost the Allies their operational momentum, it was now driving the Supreme Command toward a desperate, high-stakes gamble to unilaterally rewrite the narrative of their stalled campaign. For decades after the war, an enduring myth would dominate military memoirs: the belief that Bernard Montgomery's single northern thrust was a brilliant, war-winning masterstroke, tragically denied by American stubbornness and Eisenhower's political timidity. But cold, unforgiving quartermaster data dismantles this legend, revealing a fatal flaw that no amount of tactical genius could overcome. The problem was not just gasoline, it was the total collapse of the French railway network. Months of Allied aerial bombardment and meticulous German sabotage had systematically obliterated the tracks, switching yards, and bridges. Even if Eisenhower had completely capitulated to Montgomery's demands, stripping Patton of every single transport truck and diverting 100% of the theater's available fuel to the British, it would not have changed the outcome. A full-scale, mechanized invasion into the heavily defended German Reich required a staggering daily influx of thousands of tons of ammunition, bridging equipment, and replacement parts. Without functioning deep-water ports directly feeding intact rail lines, moving that immense volume of tonnage entirely by road over a 500-mile stretch was a physical impossibility. The bitter dispute over fuel allocations was ultimately a fierce political struggle for national prestige that completely masked this stark mathematical reality. The generals were fighting over a prize that physics simply would not allow them to claim. Yet, insulated by their massive egos and the intense political expectations radiating from Washington and London, the top Allied commanders refused to accept this arithmetic. The toxic frustration over the suddenly paralyzed front lines had to find a target. The simmering hostility between the American Supreme Commander and Britain's most celebrated general could no longer be managed through polite teletype messages or diplomatic liaison officers. It was finally about to detonate in a highly classified, closed-door showdown. On September 10th, 1944, this boiling frustration finally erupted inside a parked C-47 transport plane on an airfield in Brussels. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had flown in to meet personally with General Bernard Montgomery to resolve the escalating command crisis. The atmosphere inside the fuselage was immediately toxic. Montgomery, fiercely convinced that total victory was being squandered by American timidity, launched into a blistering, unfiltered tirade. Disregarding military decorum, the British general aggressively lectured the Supreme Commander, treating the man who had orchestrated the largest amphibious invasion in human history like a junior officer who simply did not comprehend the basic mechanics of war. Montgomery furiously demanded absolute control of the logistical pipeline, condemning the broad front strategy as a catastrophic error. For months, Eisenhower had patiently absorbed Montgomery's notorious arrogance for the sake of preserving the Anglo-American alliance. But inside that stifling aircraft, the Supreme Commander finally reached his limit. Leaning forward, Eisenhower placed his hand firmly on Montgomery's knee, physically arresting the frantic momentum of the British general's lecture. Looking him directly in the eye, Eisenhower delivered a stark, uncompromising reminder of the military hierarchy. His voice dropping to a stern register, he explicitly warned Montgomery to steady himself, stating that he could not be spoken to in that manner. He was the boss. With that single, quiet assertion of absolute authority, the overarching debate was officially terminated. Eisenhower definitively refused to completely freeze the American armies. The broad, continuous advance would remain the primary operational blueprint, but the intense political reality of the coalition still required a pressure release valve. Eisenhower understood he could not send Britain's most celebrated general back to London completely empty-handed without risking a profound diplomatic rupture. To appease his most difficult ally, maintain the fragile unity of the coalition, and attempt one last decisive blow before winter, Eisenhower agreed to a risky, resource-heavy compromise. He granted Montgomery the concentrated priority he demanded for a single, unprecedented, and highly complex airborne gamble aimed straight at the Netherlands, Operation Market Garden. The standoff in the aircraft ended with a reluctant agreement, keeping the generals united and the political alliance intact. But the heavy, devastating bill for this delicate maneuvering would soon be handed to the soldiers on the ground. That bill came due just days later, when Operation Market Garden ultimately collapsed in a catastrophic failure. Montgomery's highly prioritized airborne gamble did not pierce the heart of Germany. Instead, it shattered against the realities of a recovered enemy, leaving the Allied armies exactly where the cold mathematics of supply dictated they would be. The front lines violently solidified along the heavily fortified German border, plunging millions of exhausted soldiers into a bitter, freezing winter campaign that permanently erased the intoxicating illusion of victory by Christmas. The Great Fuel Crisis of August 1944 laid bare the harsh, defining reality of modern industrial combat. It proved that tactical boldness and the monumental egos of individual commanders are entirely subordinate to the brutal dictates of raw logistics and the immense political pressure of coalition building. Dwight Eisenhower's agonizing compromise over gasoline distribution successfully saved the Anglo-American alliance from fracturing at its most vulnerable moment. He kept his generals in line and their governments united, but the price of preserving that political unity was the grim guarantee of a longer, immeasurably costlier war. The great high-speed race across the European continent did not end with a triumphant breakthrough, a captured capital, or a glorious cavalry charge. It ended on the muddy side of a cold highway, staring at an empty fuel gauge, waiting for a supply truck that simply did not have the reach to arrive. The Allies never failed to outmaneuver the shattered German army in the late summer of 1944. Their armor and their ambition were fundamentally unstoppable. But in modern mechanized warfare, momentum is a dangerous illusion without the heavy logistics required to sustain it. They simply outran the physical limits of their own supply lines. In the end, it was a map dictated by empty gas cans, not a lack of tactical genius, that decided exactly where the great march to victory would finally freeze in its tracks.